High Noon stands among the greatest westerns ever made. But what most people don't realize is that it was written as a direct attack on McCarthyism by a screenwriter being investigated by the government while cameras were still rolling. John Wayne hated it so much that he spent years trying to discredit the film and eventually made an entirely different movie just to prove it wrong. These are 15 hidden facts about High Noon that reveal the real story behind this legendary 1952 film. Fact number 1. Changes how you watch the entire movie. Gary Cooper was in genuine physical agony throughout filming, and that's not an exaggeration. When he stepped onto the set in September of 1951, he was 50 years old and falling apart in multiple ways at once. Surgery to remove a bleeding stomach ulcer had left him weakened. Chronic lower back problems made movement painful, and a recurring hip injury changed the way he walked. His personal life offered no relief either, as he was going through a separation from his wife while ending an affair with actress Patricia Neal. Zinnemann made a deliberate choice to have Cooper wear no makeup during filming because he wanted every line on that weathered face to show on camera. The gamble paid off in ways nobody expected, and biographer Hector Arce later wrote that Cooper's ravaged face and visible discomfort, photographed as self-doubt, contributing directly to the effectiveness of his performance. What you see on Marshall Will Kane's face isn't acting in the traditional sense. A 50-year-old man in real pain stood before the cameras, and they captured every moment of it. Zinnemann even documented that he photographed Cooper sweating throughout production and crying on screen at one point. That performance earned Cooper his second Academy Award, with his first coming for Sergeant York back in 1941. The second fact takes us behind the cameras to one of the most extraordinary production stories in Hollywood history. Carl Foreman wrote the screenplay for High Noon after joining the Communist Party in 1938, becoming disillusioned, and quitting around 1942. None of that mattered to the government in 1951. And here's where the timeline becomes remarkable. Filming began on September 5th of 1951, and on September 24th of that same month, with cameras still rolling in Burbank, Carl Foreman appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He admitted his former party membership during that testimony, but refused to identify anyone else who might have attended meetings with him years earlier. That refusal earned him classification as an uncooperative witness, and by October, he found himself blacklisted. The studio forced him to sell his partnership stake for around $250,000, and before the film even reached theaters, he moved to England. The man writing the story of a marshal who stands alone when everyone abandons him was being abandoned by Hollywood in real time. The third fact reveals something hidden in plain sight. Hadleyville, the town in the film, was intentionally named to sound like Hollywood, and Carl Foreman's daughter Amanda confirmed this decades later. She wrote that when her father received his subpoena, he was already working on the screenplay, and knowing what was coming, he intended the script to be his personal testimony against the blacklist. Those cowardly townspeople who refused to stand with Marshal Kane represented Hollywood figures abandoning their colleagues to protect their own careers. Frank Miller's gang stood for the forces of McCarthyism bearing down on the industry, and Will Kane, standing alone against them all, represented Foreman himself, along with everyone else who refused to name names. Foreman once described his most common theme as the struggle of the individual against a society that for one reason or another is hostile, and that wasn't just a theme, that was his life playing out on screen. Fact number 4 speaks to Gary Cooper's character in ways that might surprise you. Cooper was a political conservative who had testified as a friendly witness at HUAC hearings back in 1947, so he was no radical by any measure. But when producer Stanley Kramer attempted to remove Foreman's name from the credits after the blacklisting, Cooper refused to accept it. Both he and director Zinnemann threatened to walk off the film entirely if the credit disappeared. Cooper went public with a statement calling Foreman the finest kind of American, and that support meant everything to the blacklisted writer. Years later, Foreman reflected on that period and put it simply, saying that Cooper was the only big one who tried to help, the only one. The fifth fact involves John Wayne, and his opposition went far beyond simply turning down a role. Wayne was offered the part of Marshal Will Kane before Gary Cooper ever saw the script. He turned it down because he recognized it as an obvious allegory against blacklisting, which Wayne actively supported. But refusing the role wasn't enough for him, and according to historical accounts, Wayne went to Foreman's house and threatened him directly, trying to pressure the screenwriter into returning to Huac to name names. The grudge lasted decades, and in a 1971 interview with Playboy, Wayne called High Noon the most un-American thing he'd ever seen in his whole life. He went further, declaring that he would never regret having helped run Foreman out of this country. Speaking with Roger Ebert in 1972, Wayne's contempt hadn't cooled. He described the film in unprintable terms and added that if he'd been the marshal, he would have been so disgusted with those cowardly townspeople that he would have just taken his wife, saddled up, and rode out of there. In the movie High Noon, the sixth fact presents an irony that borders on the absurd. When High Noon won Best Actor at the Academy Awards on March 19th of 1953, Gary Cooper was traveling in Europe and needed someone to accept on his behalf. He asked John Wayne, and Wayne agreed. Standing at that podium, holding an Oscar for a film he'd called Un-American, Wayne told the audience that now that he was through being such a good sport about all this sportsmanship, he was going back to find his business manager and agent and find out why he didn't get High Noon instead of Cooper. The man who spent years attacking the film stood at the microphone, accepting its highest honor, and joked that he wished he'd starred in it. Fact number 7 shows that Wayne wasn't alone in his contempt for the film. Director Howard Hawks shared Wayne's disapproval, and in 1959, the two of them teamed up to make what they considered a proper Western. Hawks admitted his motivation openly, stating that he made Rio Bravo because he didn't like High Noon, and neither did Duke. His complaint was specific, arguing that a good town marshal wouldn't run around town like a chicken with his head cut off, asking everyone to help, and questioning why it took a Quaker wife to save him. Zinnemann responded with measured words, noting that he admired Hawks very much and only wished he'd leave his films alone. He added that sheriffs are people, and no two people are alike, and that while High Noon takes place in the Old West, it's really a story about a man's conflict of conscience, making it a cousin to A Man for All Seasons. The 8th fact involves one of Hollywood's biggest regrets. Gregory Peck was offered the role of Marshal Will Kane before Gary Cooper, and turned it down because it seemed too similar to his recent work in The Gunfighter from 1950. Looking back on that decision, Peck called it the biggest mistake of his career. Other major stars also passed on the role, including Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, and Charlton Heston. Sometimes the right role needs to find the right actor, and Gary Cooper, with his age, his visible pain, and his weathered authenticity, turned out to be exactly what the film required. The 9th fact reveals a casting decision that shaped an entire career. Lee Van Cleef auditioned for High Noon, and producer Stanley Kramer showed interest in casting him as Deputy Harvey Pell. There was one condition attached to the offer, and Kramer wanted Van Cleef to undergo surgery to alter his nose, which the producer considered too hooked for a leading role. Van Cleef refused to surgically alter his face, and the result was immediate. Lloyd Bridges landed the deputy role, and Van Cleef was cast instead as Jack Colby, one of the villains waiting at the train station. That became Van Cleef's film debut, and it remains the only role in his entire career where he had no dialogue whatsoever. The irony is that Van Cleef went on to become one of the most iconic faces in Western cinema, and that supposedly too-hooked nose became part of his trademark look. Fact number 10 nearly derailed the film's visual style entirely. Floyd Crosby served as cinematographer on High Noon, and he deliberately studied Matthew Brady's Civil War photographs to create a stark, grainy, high-contrast look that would feel harsh and authentic. During filming in Burbank, Crosby turned the Los Angeles smog to his advantage, using it to create a blindingly white sky that contrasted with Kane's black clothes. Studio executives watched the footage and concluded it looked incompetent, nearly firing Crosby over work that was completely intentional. That harsh, documentary-style photography became one of the film's most distinctive features, and Crosby won the Golden Globe for Best Cinematography for creating exactly what the executives thought was a mistake. The 11th fact involves a shot that almost killed the director and cinematographer. One famous sequence shows the camera positioned flat between the railroad tracks as the train approaches, and filming that image nearly ended in disaster. The train's brakes failed as it bore down on the camera position, and Zinnemann and Crosby had to run for their lives. The train smashed the camera, but here's the thing. The film magazine survived the impact, and that shot, captured in those terrifying seconds before they fled, made it into the final cut of the movie. The 12th fact reveals just how thoroughly the music saturates the film. Dmitri Tiomkin composed the score for High Noon, with Ned Washington writing the lyrics and Tex Ritter performing the theme song called Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darlin'. That song and its instrumental variations appear 36 times during the film's 85-minute runtime, which means you hear some version of it roughly every 2.5 minutes. Tiomkin used an innovative instrument called the Hammond Novacord, an early electronic synthesizer, to give the score its distinctive sound. The song became a commercial sensation, with nearly 2 million records sold by 1953, and it earned the Academy Award for Best Original Song. Tiomkin also won for Best Original Score, meaning the film's music accounted for 2 of its 4 Oscar victories. Fact number 13 presents an irony that would have made Carl Foreman laugh out loud. In America, John Wayne and HUAC supporters attacked High Noon as un-American communist propaganda that glorified weakness. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, authorities criticized the same film as glorification of the individual. Both sides found it threatening for completely opposite reasons, and that might be the best evidence that Foreman created something genuinely universal. The 14th fact shows how politics may have shaped Oscar night. High Noon received a Best Picture nomination at the 25th Academy Awards in March of 1953 and lost to Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth. Rotten Tomatoes has since ranked that DeMille film as number 94 out of 95 Best Picture winners, placing it among the worst films ever to take the top award. Stanley Kramer believed the outcome wasn't coincidental, stating that High Noon's defeat had to be largely political. A film about standing up to political persecution lost the highest honor in cinema, possibly because of the same political pressure it depicted on screen. The 15th fact takes us to Poland in 1989. When Poland held its first partially free elections after decades of communist rule, the Solidarity movement created an election poster based on High Noon. The image showed Gary Cooper holding a ballot instead of a gun, with the message translating to High Noon, June 4th, 1989. Former Solidarity leader Lech Walesa wrote about the significance of that image, and the story of one person standing alone against tyranny while others looked away resonated powerfully with people who had lived under oppression. A few additional facts deserve mention before closing. President Bill Clinton screened High Noon at the White House somewhere between 17 and 20 times, more than any other film during his presidency. Clinton explained his attachment to the film by noting that it's a movie about courage in the face of fear, about a man doing what he thought was right despite knowing it could cost him everything, and that Gary Cooper is terrified the whole way through without pretending to be some macho guy. President Dwight Eisenhower also loved the film and screened it at least 3 times, reportedly counting it among his all-time favorites. President Ronald Reagan cited it as a favorite as well, pointing to the protagonist's strong commitment to duty and the law. 3 presidents spanning different political perspectives all found themselves drawn to the same story. Katy Jurado, who played Helen Ramirez, became the first Latin American actress to win a Golden Globe Award for her performance in this film. The 85-minute runtime almost precisely matches the story's timeline, which runs from about 10:35 in the morning to high noon, making it groundbreaking for its real-time storytelling approach. Grace Kelly was only 21 or 22 years old during filming, and this was her second film, rather than her debut. Her first appearance came in a small part in 14 Hours, from 1951, and Zinnemann admitted she was very wooden at the time, while adding that her lack of experience and sort of gauche behavior struck him as very touching and right for the character. Kelly herself wasn't satisfied with her performance and felt she came across too stiff as Amy Kane, but audiences and critics disagreed, and her career was just beginning. High Noon was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry in 1989, ranking among the first 25 films ever chosen for that honor. The American Film Institute placed it at number 27 on their list of the 100 greatest American films, and Marshall Will Kane ranked as the fifth greatest hero in film history. Carl Foreman went on to write The Bridge on the River Kwai in 1957, but because of the blacklist, he received no screen credit at the time. The Academy awarded him the Oscar posthumously in 1984, and he learned the news the day before he died. High Noon endures not just because it's a well-crafted Western with an iconic performance at its center. It endures because real conflict forged it. The fear, visible in Gary Cooper's eyes, was genuine. The story of a man abandoned by his community came from a writer being abandoned by his industry. The moral question at the heart of the film was the same question Carl Foreman faced in that hearing room in September of 1951. John Wayne spent decades trying to discredit this film, calling it un-American, and making Rio Bravo to demonstrate how a real Western should work. But when people in Poland were fighting for their freedom in 1989, they didn't reach for Rio Bravo. One person standing alone, terrified but refusing to bend, says more than all the swagger in the world. If you enjoyed learning about the hidden history behind High Noon, subscribe for more deep dives into classic cinema, and let me know in the comments which classic film you'd like explored next.